Well, yesterday, as I was talking about obeying the truth, one of the things that Paul follows up with is that obedience is manifested in a sincere love for your brothers. And one of my favorite cynical witticisms is sincerity is the main thing, and once you learn to fake it, you got it made. And we live in a world with a lot of fake sincerity, a lot of people who talk about loving and caring and so forth, but in reality, it's just a manipulation that they use to get you to cooperate and or invest or do whatever they want you to do. They're really not looking out for your welfare. I think one of the key phrases I hear sometimes when people say, well, this is a win-win for both of us. And I find that there's nothing in the world that's a win-win in the total sense, because in order for you to benefit, then I have to give up some of the benefit in order to see you prosper. And the Bible tells us that that often is the right approach to life, that we find as parents that we are not in a win-win relationship with our kids, at least initially, that we invest a lot of time, money, and energy, love, care, and concern, and so forth and so on, in order to see them launch successfully into life. And sometimes that pays off wonderfully, and sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes they end up being a source of heartache and disappointment and loss, and it's not really a win-win. Do you regret that you loved them the way you did? No. Do you regret the sacrifice and investment you made? No. But what you do regret is that they chose, in spite of that, to cut their own path and to make their own choice in life, and brought a lot of heartache to them and to yourself. So this idea of sincerity is really a slippery one in a culture that likes to be slippery. And that's why we use words a lot of times to disguise rather than to inform what we're really about and what we're really up to. Not a new dynamic in human society, but it's one that is reaching a level of expertise with our technology and AI fakes and everything else, that we're getting to a place where it's hard to know what is real and what is not. And that's really what the word sincere here means. It means, literally, you translate it, without hypocrisy. And hypocrisy means play acting. It's like you're pretending to be something that you're not. And so he says, when you love people sincerely, it's going to be manifested in how you treat them when they're being good, when they're being bad, and when they're being ugly. And what that means is simply that you don't allow roots of bitterness and resentment and metastasize into what's called malice. And what I mean is, it starts really with a resentment, where somebody does something and you kind of very pridefully say, how dare they do that to me? Who do they think they are? Don't they recognize how special and important I am? And so forth and so on. Quite honestly, we often get deeply offended because we think that the person who has offended us has no right to offend us. One of the things I think is really interesting is when you're really walking in the Spirit, you can be offended by people and not feel it and even not even recognize it. You can be insulted by people and not know that you've been insulted. I remember I was going to a conference one time with another pastor, and this gentleman who I've never seen in my life came up to me and he says, well, excuse me, but I need to ask your forgiveness. And I thought, okay, for what? He says, well, I've really been resentful of you and I've said bad things about you. And he goes on with this whole thing and he says, I want to apologize. That was wrong. And so I thought, okay, you're forgiven, whatever. It didn't even register me. And afterwards, the pastor I was with looked at me and says, I can't believe you let that go. And I said, well, what was I supposed to do with it? I mean, it's like, you can't have a tug of war if you don't pick up the other end of the rope. And I've got enough tug of wars in my life. I don't need to go around picking up other ropes and engage in conflicts. But it was so interesting because it didn't really affect me. In fact, I couldn't identify that man in a crowd or even in a lineup today. I just didn't pay any attention to it, because wherever that came from, however that got into his head, that's something that the devil put there, and I don't want to camp on that site. It's not a place where I want to live. But that's what happens to us many times. Something happens, we become resentful, and we think, how dare they do that to me? Resentment, if it's not confronted and addressed and repented of, will become bitterness. And bitterness means that it begins to spoil everything. It's kind of like if you put wormwood or some kind of noxious tasting thing inside of your drink. from that point on, that drink is going to be a bitter pill to take, and you're going to resent it. You're not going to want it. You're going to spit it out of your mouth. And that's what he says happens, is that you go from being resentful to becoming embittered, and then everything that comes out of you is bitterness. And everything that comes out of you is, I can't believe that they did this to me, and the way they acted and who they are and what they are. And I share this with you quite transparently because not only have I had to battle through this myself, and that's what you do, but I know that you do. And many of you, maybe this is timely because you're right in that spot. You're battling through the bitterness. In fact, you may be so settled into your bitterness, it's taken such a root in your life that you don't even recognize that's what's going on. You don't recognize that there's a resentment and a hatefulness towards other people, and you're thinking about how can they do this and how can they do that, and they call themselves a Christian, and you have all this stuff going on in you, and you think you're righteous because this stuff is going on in you and coming out of you, when in God's eyes, you're pretty wicked right now and you need to repent. Because here's what happens. If you don't deal with that resentment, the next phase is maliciousness. It becomes malice. Malice is where you begin to plot how you're going to get even. You ever had those things where somebody said something that hurt your feeling, and then you go away later on thinking, boy, I tell you, if they ever say that to me again, or anybody says that, this is what I'm going to say. And you start planning your response, how you're going to really put them in their place. And, I hope you can identify with what I'm talking about. I hate to think that I'm the only one out here who does this kind of stuff. You begin to calculate this stuff in your mind. And the truth of the matter is that opportunity is not going to rebirth itself. And even if you did, you'd probably create such a deeper chasm with that other person that there's never any future hope of reconciliation. So the key here is that if we're going to sincerely love other people, we have to really lay aside resentments, because I don't care how much you love somebody, you're going to find that, I put it this way, people in proximity produce problems. So one of the things that was a shock to my wife and I after we got married was that we began to find ourselves resenting each other for all sorts of little petty things. That my wife resented things in me that I didn't even know that she would resent, and vice versa. And so you begin to pick and poke at each other. There's kind of a contemptuous tension that begins to build in the relationship. And what you don't realize is that you're clinging to a resentment, and you think things like this in your mind. If they really loved me, they wouldn't do that. Well, that might be true. That might not be true. The whole point is that it may not be based upon anything that's realistically. They may not even be aware that what you're doing irritates them. And we all have those things that are like that. They're like fingernails on the chalkboard, right? And it just drives you crazy. Well, we all have those dynamics in our personality, and it shows up in one place or another. But the whole idea is that when you give place to resentment, you get stuck in this place of bitterness, and eventually it will drive you to malice. And malice is what causes divorce in the end. I just discovered last night, to my heartbreak, that the two people I once was in ministry together with had gotten a divorce. And in fact, it had happened many years ago, and I wasn't even aware of it. And it was just a sadness my wife and I had when we realized that. We thought, what happened? Well, I know part of it was there was a resentment that I saw building way back years ago that eventually became solidified into bitterness. The roots began to go down, and the further the roots go, the harder it is to excrete bitterness from your life. And then one day, malice came out there that one or both of them said to the other, I'm divorcing you. And that becomes my action. I'm going to punish you by dumping you. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that all divorces are driven by malice. There are situations where the Bible actually gives permission and says you can under these circumstances. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about most of the rest of us who find ourselves having marriages that fail because one or both of you has maliciously decided that you want to punish the other person. We don't ever, admit that to ourselves, but that's really almost always what's really going on. And that's what stands in the way of fulfilling the command that we love one another deeply. How can I love somebody deeply if I haven't found it hard to love them at all? And that's something I would leave with you to ponder. Can you really love somebody deeply if you haven't had to dig down deep to find God's source of love, that artesian well of his love? That sometimes we have to spend a lot of time asking God to forgive us for the resentments and for the bitterness and even some malicious actions, that we have to ask God, forgive me for that, because it's destroying me on the inside. And it may not be evident, but you find that your world just starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Because once you get into the path of resentment and bitterness and maliciousness, you find that you find more and more opportunities, almost unavoidably, to become resentful, to become bitter, and then to act maliciously, so that you become that proverbial, grandfather on the front lawn yelling, "Get off my lawn, you stupid kids!" That guy that every kid in the neighborhood fears and hates. How did that guy get that way? He got resentful, and he became bitter, and now he's maliciously expressing it by yelling at kids who are just trying to have a good time. Oh, we'll continue tomorrow and try to wrap this up and kind of put a nice, pretty bow on it. Many blessings.